Special thanks to Thrax from the USFC Discord for submitting this scenario and writing the incredible conclusion. The Siberian taiga is one of the most paradoxical stretches of land on the planet. It's also one of the largest, quite endless, quite mysterious. It, not like its more mountainous counterparts in the North American Appalachian Range or the Canadian taigas, are the producers of some of the most tantalizing folklore, legend, and wives' tales. But on June 30th, 1908, the Siberian taiga was shaken in a manner not even the Chuchunya or the Mekheni could manage. That dawn, its pine forests were still calmly bathed in the soft golden light of the early morning sun. The land was still, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant calls of birds greeting the dawn. In the small settlements scattered along the Podkamenaya Tunguska River, Evenki hunters and Russian settlers stirred from their sleep. Then, at precisely 7:13 a.m., the sky ignited. A blinding, blue-white fireball streaked through the upper atmosphere, its brilliance outshining even the rising sun. A roaring thunder followed, a sound unlike anything ever heard, as if the heavens themselves had cracked open. The ground trembled violently. In an instant, an apocalyptic wave of heat and force erupted in the sky, flattening trees, incinerating wildlife, and sending shockwaves rippling across the landscape that could be recorded as far away as Washington, D.C. A fiery column ascended into the atmosphere, splitting the sky with an otherworldly glow that could be seen as far away as the British Isles and Iceland. A Russian settler, Semyon Semyonov, witnessed the event from more than 60 kilometers away. He stated that his face was seared with heat, and he was thrown off his feet by the force of the blast. He later recalled, "Suddenly, in the north sky, the sky was split in two, and high above the forest, the whole northern part of the sky appeared covered with fire. At that moment, I became so hot that I couldn't bear it, as if my shirt was on fire." For over an hour, the land rumbled. A towering column of smoke rose into the stratosphere. In its wake, 2,000 square kilometers of forest lay in ruins. Some 80 million trees felled in an instant. For decades, the Tunguska event remained an enigma. Early theories ranged from a volcanic explosion to supernatural speculations. However, modern research, based on seismic readings, eyewitness accounts, and later expeditions, suggests that the event was caused by an atmospheric explosion of a large celestial object, likely an asteroid or comet. We can estimate that the object was approximately 50 to 60 meters in diameter, and exploded at an altitude of 5 to 10 kilometers, or 15,000 to 30,000 feet, above the ground. The detonation released an energy equivalent to 10 to 15 megatons of TNT, roughly 1,000 times the power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and about a third of the power of Tsar Bomba, the most powerful nuclear bomb ever created. The asteroid had flown in with a speed of about 27 kilometers per second, about Mach 80. The Tunguska event is the largest impact of a meteor on Earth in recorded human history. Unlike typical meteorite impacts, the Tunguska explosion left no crater. The airburst was so intense that it flattened trees in a radial pattern, with their trunks pointing away from the epicenter. The explosion's heat charred trees at ground zero, yet the force of the shockwave extinguished any potential fires before they could spread. Thousands of partially decomposed deer carcasses were found in a radius around the site by later explorers and scientists. Tiny fragments of the meteorite, measuring less than a millimeter across, were later discovered, lending credibility to the theory that the object disintegrated completely upon impact, along with a lake, Lake Cheka, which could have been formed by a 10-meter fragment of the Tunguska meteor, which separated and hit the ground at that location. Although the region of Siberia the meteor hit was sparsely populated, a total of 3 recorded deaths occurred due to the explosion, and the resulting atmospheric disturbances caused bizarre optical effects. For weeks, the skies over Russia and Europe remained eerily bright at night, as particles from the blast reflected sunlight long after dusk. Now, the Tunguska event took place in a really turbulent period for the Russian Empire. The country was still reeling from its defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, and economic instability plagued the empire, leading to the revolt of 1905, which led to the deaths of anywhere between 13,000 to 17,000 people across various Russian cities, though these figures are hotly contested. The revolution of 1905 shook the autocratic rule of Tsar Nicholas II, forcing him to implement constitutional reforms and establish the Duma, or the parliament. Now, Russia was pacifying Crimea at this time, which it had recently acquired from the Ottomans as well, and it was still far from having thoroughly familiarized itself with the Central Asian, Siberian, and Far Eastern portions of its empire. Besides that, the Trans-Siberian Railway project was underway, but not yet complete, and the funding for the project was still under question by the Duma, which Tsar Nicholas II would dismiss several times during this period, causing serious political instability. Of course, all of this stuff occurring in Russia and also in Europe would culminate in the First and Second Balkan Wars, which primed Russia to necessarily intervene to protect Serbia and its global prestige and interest in the Balkans and the Black Sea when the July crisis unfolded in 1914, only 6 years later. So as you can tell, the Tunguska event really happened during a period of great political uncertainty in Russia. There were many events happening all at once that pushed Russia towards these crazy crises that would happen later in the 1910s. But despite its massive scale, the Tunguska event went largely unnoticed by the Russian government for years. The remoteness of the impact zone meant that, beyond local accounts, there was little urgency to investigate. It wasn't until 1927, nearly 2 decades later, that Soviet scientist Leonid Kulik led the first official expedition to the site. But if the object had entered the atmosphere just a few hours earlier, with the speed and tilt of the Earth on her axis, it could have exploded over a major Russian or other European city. The devastation could have dwarfed the destruction seen in Hiroshima or Nagasaki decades later. Yet by sheer luck, the explosion occurred over one of the most remote, uninhabited regions on Earth. The only casualties, besides the 3 unconfirmed deaths, were the trees and the wildlife of the Siberian taiga. But what if that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the Tunguska meteor hit the capital of the Russian Empire, St. Petersburg? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting our Legion like our current channel members Eaglefall, Derek Arno, Wolfgang von Siefertberg, Stratocrat, and Daniel Andrulis. Anyway, thanks, and enjoy the video. At 2:30 a.m. local time on June 30th, 1908, the great imperial capital of Russia, St. Petersburg, lay under the cool embrace of a midsummer night. It was the city of the Tsars, the beating heart of the empire. A city of palatial splendor, glittering canals, gold leaf covering the facades of the palaces of the city, ornate lamps lighting the grand boulevards. The Neva River glistened under the pale moonlight, reflecting the golden spires of the Admiralty and the onion domes of its many cathedrals. In the Winter Palace, government clerks and servants worked the late hours, shuffling documents for the bureaucracy of the empire. In the factories of the city, laborers toiled away on the night shift, forging steel and assembling weapons for the Tsar's armies, repairing their capabilities after the war with Japan. Along the embankments, a few night watchmen made their rounds, while the occasional carriage rattled down cobblestone streets. The city's 1.5 million residents slept in peace, oblivious to the doom that raced toward them from the heavens. Had anyone been looking to the east, they would have seen it, a growing star, impossibly bright, moving toward the city. At first it was mistaken for an astronomical wonder, A comet, perhaps, or an especially brilliant shooting star, even an angel come to bless mighty Russia for her crusade against the Ottomans. Then, in a matter of seconds, it became clear that this was no benevolent act of God. The sky split apart, and we all know the rest. A blinding blue-white fireball tore through the upper atmosphere, heating the air to thousands of degrees. Windows shattered in their frames, horses reared and screamed, and a wave of panic swept through the few who were awake to witness it. Then came the blast. A titanic explosion, releasing a blast 5,000 times larger than the Halifax explosion, the largest conventional explosion in history, would have detonated in the skies above St. Petersburg. The shockwave would expand outward at supersonic speeds, flattening everything in its path. Stone buildings crumpling as though made of paper, the domes of the city's great cathedrals imploding, the Winter Palace itself, home to centuries of Romanov rule, would simply be wiped from existence. A searing wave of heat, hot enough to ignite stone and melt metal, swept through the city, incinerating everything flammable. Wooden homes, market stalls, the great libraries of the city, each was consumed in an instant. Those caught in the streets were burned to cinders before they could even comprehend what had happened. The explosion's force would send a column of superheated gases and debris thousands of meters into the sky, a massive mushroom cloud rising over the ruins of St. Petersburg, glowing ominously in the pre-dawn light. The shockwave would race outward, tearing through the countryside, shattering windows in Helsinki, Stockholm, and Berlin, and shaking buildings as far as Paris, Belgrade, and London. The blast would be heard across the entire continent of Europe, with reports of a thunderous explosion coming as far away as Rome and Constantinople. The world had just witnessed the most catastrophic explosion in recorded human history, and the complete and total destruction of the heart of the Russian Empire. Founded by Tsar Peter the Great in 1703, St. Petersburg was built to be Russia's window to Europe, and rapidly transformed into a modern imperial capital. Tsar Peter ordered the vast engineering feats to reclaim marshlands along the Neva River. Over the centuries, the city grew, each Tsar and Tsarina adding to the splendor and opulence. The city boasted grand palaces, majestic statues and monuments, including the Alexander Column in Senate Square, commemorated Russia's military and cultural history. Lavish Baroque and neoclassical style buildings, designed by architects like Bartolomeo Rastrelli, graced its cathedrals, libraries, and public buildings, all built to stand as a testament to the unending power and prestige of Russia. All of that was now gone, reduced to ash and noise. The Neva River, displaced by the explosion, flooded into the ruins, drowning whatever remained. The survivors, those fortunate enough to be outside the main blast radius, could do little but stare in horror. Across the empire, telegraph operators desperately attempted to contact St. Petersburg, but there was no response. In Moscow, Russia's second major population center, messages from Sweden and Germany described a blinding explosion in the northern sky. It wouldn't be until dawn that the full extent of the disaster became clear. The capital of Russia was gone. Over 1.6 million people were dead. Based on the records we have available to us, it's unclear where Tsar Nicholas II would have been on the morning of June 30th, 1908. He was either in St. Petersburg, God forbid, or Tallinn in Estonia, which was called Revel at the time. In 1908, Tsar Nicholas II and a small retinue made a trip to Revel aboard the imperial yacht Standard, following a diplomatic summit with King Edward VII. The aim of the meeting seemed to have been to work on a plan to enable Bulgarian nationalist groups in Macedonia in order to weaken the Ottoman Empire. The Tsar would spend an undisclosed period of time after his 3-day visit with the British king in order to inspect the development of the Baltic ports. And for the sake of our scenario, in order that the entire Romanov family does not perish instantly, we'll assume Tsar Nicholas was in revel during the blast. He would be awoken in the middle of the night to broken glass, a burning sensation, and a bright flash of light which would leave him temporarily blinded. Assuming he may be in the presence of an angel of sorts, Nicholas would fall to his feet, before hearing the noises of confusion and chaos outside in the streets. When the first reports would reach Revel later that morning, there would be a great confusion. Some thought there had been an earthquake. Others speculated that some terrible accident had occurred at one of the Empire's many munitions depots. But the truth was beyond comprehension. By midday, Nicholas, very likely pale and bewildered, would have learned the truth of the situation. The city was no more. His ministers, his court, his family members who had remained behind, all were presumed dead. There was no precedent for this. The only certainty was that Russia was now in chaos. But there was, unfortunately, no time for mourning. The immediate problem Nicholas faced was that nearly all central ministries, the Duma, the upper echelons of the bureaucracy, they had all been eradicated. The natural alternative capital would be Moscow. It remained the spiritual and historical heart of Russia, home to the Kremlin, and was the most developed city after St. Petersburg. However, Moscow was also a stronghold of revolutionary sentiment, filled with radical workers' councils, or Soviets, and political agitators who were sure to be emboldened by the government's sudden collapse. The transition would not be smooth. Given that Nicholas was already there, Revel might serve as a temporary emergency command center. However, its small size and proximity to the Baltic Sea, and thus foreign influence, and its lack of infrastructure made it an untenable choice for the long term. Eventually, Nicholas would have to return to Moscow, to a city of agitators. Now, some among the Russian people, already burdened by food shortages, economic instability, and the humiliation of the Japanese War, interpreted this disaster as a divine omen. Many saw it as proof of the somewhat widespread belief, though certainly this is dubious, that Nicholas II's rule was cursed, divine punishment for his failures. On top of that, the Russian army had already been weakened by the 1905 revolution and the defeat against Japan. With its leadership in St. Petersburg annihilated, individual generals would begin acting on their own authority. Some pledged loyalty to the Tsar, while others formed independent military commands to restore order. The revolutionaries, too, would launch an insurrection in Moscow almost immediately. By late summer 1908, the city would be in open rebellion, with Red Guards, so to speak, seizing control. Polish nationalists also would immediately declare independence, perhaps backed by German and Austrian diplomatic support. Russian forces in Poland would be leaderless and demoralized, and the Polish militias would swiftly take control, expelling them from Poland and threatening Lviv in Austria-Hungary with the instability. But unlike Poland, Finland was relatively content under Russian rule. However, with no government in place, Finnish leaders would simply see no alternative but to take control of their own administration. Finland's parliament would establish a provisional government to prepare for self-rule should it be necessary. In Central Asia, the Khanates of Bukhara and Khiva would reassert their autonomy, while Armenia and Georgia would see nationalist movements, along with the Don Cossacks, who were sent in the wake of the crisis to respond to workers' revolts in Ukraine and other cities in Russia. The whirlwind of chaos would be plastered across newspapers and bulletins across the continent over the coming weeks and even months. European governments would be unable to comprehend the situation. Russia had seemingly simply fallen apart in a matter of days. The German government would begin sending aid to the Russians. This would come as part of a broader emerging trend. The Red Cross societies, along with the British, Germans, French, Serbs, Greeks, and even the Swedes and Danes, would begin sending aid. The Moscow Patriarch would also call upon Christendom, in whatever loose form it still existed, to send help to the wounded and lost. However, from the still-standing cities of Moscow, Yekaterinburg, Revel, and others, missionary relief groups would find themselves dodging roving bands of anarchists, peasant communes, opportunistic nationalist groups, and even doomsday cults. But as time pressed on for the bordering nations, the crisis would cause more alarm than it would sympathy. The Austrians would soon be forced to mobilize troops along their borders, as would the Germans in East Prussia, anticipating floods of refugees, and in the Austrians' case, Polish nationalists. Other nations would take a different approach. Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II would see the catastrophe as an opportunity. Ottoman forces would casually advance into the Caucasus, reclaiming Batumi and enforcing Azeri nationalist movements in Baku. The move would be framed as a protection of the faithful from Russian collapse. These actions would spark unrest among Armenians in both the Ottoman Empire proper and the Russian Empire, and among the Georgians in Russia as well. The British would quickly move into Persia to secure the oil assets of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, anticipating unrest in Qajar, Iran, which essentially amounted to a Russian client state at this point. The Ottomans wouldn't be the only ones taking a more opportunistic view of the situation, however. News of Russia's devastation would reach Tokyo within a few weeks. The Meiji government viewed this as divine confirmation of its supremacy. The Japanese, seeing no Russian ability to respond, would thus land forces in Vladivostok under the pretext of preventing anarchy. Japanese military planners would debate how far they could push. Some would demand a seizing of portions of this Trans-Siberian Railway, securing full control over Manchuria and parts of eastern Siberia, and preventing them from falling into the hands of these rebel governments. Tokyo would be hesitant, though. Russia was certainly their enemy, but in some instances, the enemy one knows is preferable to the enemy they do not. The enemy they knew not were quickly consolidating power, however. In the chaos, a certain man would return from exile from the city of Paris. Vladmir Lenin would arrive in Moscow in July and begin to rally Bolshevik forces to his side. The Russian state had, since the crisis, essentially ceased to function in any meaningful way, and what would follow this circumstance in the vacuum of power in Moscow would be a cataclysmic civil war. In response to Lenin and the Bolsheviks and these other red agitators, Grand Duke Nicholas, the Tsar's cousin and former wartime commander, would attempt to restore authority over the military, declaring martial law. But the army would find itself without clear orders, without supplies due to interruptions of the rail and carriage routes, and without knowledge of whether or not they would find payment for their services, and beyond that, in many cases, with a severely shaken loyalty to the dynasty. Entire divisions in the coming days would disband as their officers fled, and rank-and-file soldiers turned either to revolutionary factions, the looting of the cities, or the swearing of the loyalty to the highest bidder. From the ruins of the Russian state in Moscow, the self-declared Supreme Council for National Salvation, led by Grand Duke Nicholas, a mix of monarchists, conservative generals, and pro-constitutional reformists, would attempt to rally a loyalist band of forces. But meanwhile, the industrial cities of the Volga and the Urals would see workers' Soviets take control, aligning with these socialist factions. Some of them aligning with the Mensheviks, some with the Bolsheviks, others with the anarchists, others simply desperate for food and stability. The countryside would descend into a form of chaos, as peasant communes would seize land from fleeing nobles, while roving bands of former Cossack units carved out their own fiefdoms. Lenin's arrival in Moscow was, in his mind, an action to turn the tides in the favor of the Bolsheviks and begin to push his vanguardist political theories into action. But unlike his return in our own history, in the actual Russian Civil War, where he would arrive as a sort of messianic figure to a party on the rise and a government paralyzed by its own indecision, the situation in 1908 would be far less favorable to the Bolsheviks. Socialism would be far more splintered. The Mensheviks were still thoroughly dominant in many urban centers, and they would reject Lenin's calls for immediate armed insurrection, preferring to form alliances with the workers' Soviets and more moderate socialists. The socialist revolutionaries, popular among the peasantry, waged their own campaign against the remnants of the Tsarist authority, and beyond the left, those nationalist forces were carving out their own claims against the empire, like in Khiva and in the Don. So in essence, for Lenin, the first step would be necessarily survival, not a consolidation of power as it had been when he returned in our own history. The Supreme Council would have placed a bounty on his head, compounding these factors. a bounty many disgruntled former soldiers would be happy to fulfill to earn some extra cash, and Bolshevik cells across Moscow would already find themselves under siege. Lacking numbers and resources, Lenin turned to the only group that shared his revolutionary zeal: the anarchists and the radical workers' militias. He would orchestrate an armed uprising in Moscow later in July, seizing rail depots, government offices, and industrial sites. The Red Guard, as they became known, would clash with loyalist troops in a brutal, week-long battle that left much of the city in flames. Though Lenin's forces held parts of Moscow, the Bolsheviks would still remain a minority faction in a war rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. Now, the collapse of Russia would by this point become increasingly intolerable to the concert-minded of Europe. The German Empire was already internally deeply concerned about the prospect of socialist revolution, and the Kaiser now faced the nightmare scenario of this anarchy spilling across its eastern borders. The British were equally fearful of the collapse of Russia, which would leave a power vacuum and tilt the scale of continental power in the favor of the Germans, the Austrians, and the Ottomans. France, too, would be in dismay, but more so at the potential loss of an ally in the Tsar. In response to the situation, Berlin would deploy troops into the Baltic, ostensibly to restore order and prevent the chaos from destabilizing East Prussia. Riga and Vilnius soon found themselves under German occupation, with local elites quick to declare provisional governments in alliance with Berlin, while the British and the French would begin to prepare for an intervention to save the Russian state if needed. As autumn arrived, the Russian Civil War would have fully ignited. The Supreme Council in Moscow would launch a new counteroffensive against Bolshevik-controlled districts. The Battle of Moscow bore witness to street-to-street combat between the Red Guards, anarchists, and the Tsarist forces. The Bolsheviks, outgunned and outnumbered, would eventually be forced into retreat, regrouping in the Volga region alongside socialist revolutionaries and the radical peasant militias. By this point, the Russian Far East would be, for all intents and purposes, defenseless. The Trans-Siberian Railway, what was constructed at least, lay in disrepair, its stations overrun by deserters, bandits, and revolutionaries. The collapse of St. Petersburg would have cut off all chains of command, leaving entire garrisons and workers' forces leaderless. In November, after months of deliberation, the Imperial Japanese Army would have advanced along the railway, securing junctions in Khabarovsk and Chita. In Siberia, the Trans-Siberian War would unfold between Japanese forces who clashed with white Russian units still loyal to the Tsar, as well as local Siberian warlords who declared independence in the absence of central authority, whether they be socialist or not. By the end of 1908, Japan will have come to control much of the railway east of Lake Baikal, though guerrilla resistance would continue to plague their grip on the region. President Taft of the United States of America would offer to send his own troops to normalize the situation in the Russian Far East, and prop up Japanese forces as a stabilizing force, due to both American investment in the railway, Taft's unprecedentedly positive relationship with the Japanese, and American open-door policy, which was intended to ensure equal trading rights in China, which the Trans-Siberian Railway was a crucial component of. Now, while the Americans and Japanese took to securing the East, the Caucasian Wars would escalate in the West as Armenian, Georgian, Azeri, Iranian, Kurdish, and Turkish nationalist militias would fight not only the Ottomans but each other, resulting in an unimaginably complicated conflict. Armenian fighters, fearing both Ottoman and Bolshevik encroachment, would declare an independent Armenia, which stretched, on paper at least, into established Ottoman territory in Armenia, and they would fight tooth and nail for survival. Their claims would cause a full-scale Ottoman military response, leading to the threat of British intervention by way of Iran in defense of the Armenians, with a large outcry from the French and Greeks in support of such a maneuver. Now, throughout all of this chaos, though, one question has thus far remained unanswered. Nicholas II, as we set him up to be, is still in revel, and he had become, essentially, a ruler without a kingdom. The Germans were now marching into Estonia and prepared to assist him in reasserting control, but he knew it would come at the expense of the empire his ancestors had built over decades, centuries even. As 1909 dawned, the Russian Civil War showed no signs of abating. It was a war not just of ideology, but of survival. A war in which monarchists, republicans, socialists, nationalists, and foreign invaders all vied for control over the vast corpse of a shattered empire. while food, ammunition, and basic supplies were precious commodities. From Moscow to Vladivostok, from Baku to the Arctic, Russia burned, while a global socialist revolution which promised to grip the entire world was seeding its roots in the festering wound that was Moscow in early 1909. The British Empire, having witnessed all of its efforts in the Great Game and Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 undone, would push for a settlement by the European nations to stabilize Russia, or at the very least, what was left of it. But with the advances of Japan and the Ottomans, the rest of the vultures would begin to descend and take their piece of the carcass. The Germans capitalized on Polish nationalism by recognizing an uprising in newly free Warsaw, offering diplomatic recognition in exchange for economic and military integration. Sweden, having recently released an independent kingdom of Norway in the west, would send troops in support of friendly movements in Finland and Novgorod, establishing a client kingdom in the process. The Austrians had already moved to annex Bosnia, like in our own timeline, and with the Ottomans distracted and the Serbs without a protector to intimidate them, they would be able to consolidate their rule unopposed. And thus, hoping to end the chaos, the British and the French would send military reinforcements to Tsar Nicholas II to help stabilize the situation internally in what lands the empire still held. But even as these efforts rolled out, it became apparent that Russia was shattered beyond recovery. By February of 1909, the revolutionary forces of Russia would be effectively routed, but the seized territories would be written off as unrecoverable. Russia had barely been able to win a war with itself. How on earth would it be able to wage a multi-front war to reclaim its lost lands? It was decided then, without even the consultation of the Tsar, that a conference would be held to finalize the situation. The Copenhagen Treaty of 1909 would solidify the borders of the new nations born out of this chaotic period, with Nicholas II left without a choice, signing away the breadth of his empire. Sailing past the cratered ruins of St. Petersburg as he made his way to the relocated capital in Moscow, he could only imagine the voices of his predecessors looking down upon the desolation. In the words of a certain poet who was greatly influential on Russian literature in the 20th century, the Englishman Percy Shelley, "Look upon our works, ye mighty, and despair." And that's where I'll be ending this scenario for today. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.